You know, there's a great misconception that when Jesus walked the earth, Judah, where he was walking, was governed and policed by the Romans. And since Jesus, according to the Bible, had little recorded interaction with the Roman government, Jesus must not have been involved in politics. And for that reason, Christians should not be involved in politics today. Now, Judah was an occupied territory of Rome, but the Romans had a tradition. And what it was is that wherever they took over a place, a country, a nation, if it had a fully functioning operational government, it left it alone. It let it do its own thing. It didn't need to add to itself more burdens of governing more people. And so actually, the Romans let the Jews there in Judea do their own thing. Rome simply provided a presence in their appointment of King Herod. But the government of Judah, as you know, was called the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin in Hebrew, made up of three groups. The graphateus, they were the scribes, call them the lawyers. They dealt with records, bureaucracy, administration. We would call them the Judicial Branch. And then there was the Perushim and the Sadducees, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the orthodox Pharisees and the liberal Sadducees, the party of the Jewish aristocrats. They made law. That's what their job was. We would call them the legislative branch. And then there was the third branch. It was the executive branch. Over that was the Kohen, the priests. And the high priest, you might say, was the president of the whole thing. And the White House of that priest is called the temple. So the Sanhedrin had legislative, executive, judicial, civil, religious authority, but the rabbis were the actual religious leaders. Contrary to popular Gentile belief, we think it was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. No, it's the rabbis. And they were just like the pastors today. That's what the rabbis were like in their day. And Jesus, if you remember, was a rabbi. And Jesus' government wanted to silence Jesus, the rabbi. Now, the Sanhedrin was a representative government based on primary law, the law of God. And the Sanhedrin could generate secondary laws as long as it did not violate the primary law. And does that sound familiar? It's what our founding fathers had in mind for our government. James Madison, the principal author of the Constitution, he said, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it, but we have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." The 10 Commandments of God is what we call primary law. Secondary law is all the other stuff that they keep adding on to it every day. Now, I've heard pastors and churchgoers claim that neither Jesus nor his followers ever said anything against a politician. Well, Jesus told his followers to beware the yeast of King Herod, referring to Herod's communicable, pleasure-seeking, godless way of life. He also called King Herod a fox, which was to say in that day a gigolo. John the Baptist was beheaded after calling Herod on sleeping with his brother's wife. I think that's political. Jesus told his politicians, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that underneath the suit and tie, they were rotting corpses, and he called them vipers, the devil's next of kin. And then he added, "How will you escape being condemned to hell?" Now, there are people today who, if they lived in Jesus' day, would have rebuked Jesus when he came down hard on these politicians, and they would have told him, "You're not being very Christ-like, Jesus." Notice, Jesus called his politicians on their double standards and their restrictive and ever-expanding legislation. Jesus said, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Now, our government puts his to shame as it protects the pornographer, the abortionist, the sexual deviant, and it pushes for bathrooms to be used by both boys and girls, males and females. It pushes trans education in kindergarten. And for how many years in a row now, our government tells us to celebrate all June long, if not all summer long, the month as National LGBTQS, all those other things that keep getting added to it. And I want to remind you that like homosexuality, bisexuality simply describes someone's sexual proclivities, their habits to be sexually active with men and women. Why would President Obama, when he was in the office, tell this nation to celebrate that? Why would I want to explain that even to my kids? Whoa. The liberal establishment paints the perverse as the epitome of loving commitment and morality, while the Boy Scouts and people of faith are the deviant hypocrites. Pastor Jim Garlow of Skyline Church, San Diego, a friend of mine, he said, of all the things for God to open his word with, catch this, of all the things for God to open his word with, it is male and female specificity. Secondly, you have marriage. And then you have procreation. If I were Satan, I would take the least contested ground first, the third, and create a procedure and an industry called abortion and destroy the results of procreation, the very proof of male and female alone having the ability to reproduce. Then once having done that, I would go to the second one and begin to redefine marriage. And if I could do that, then I'd go back to the first one and do away with gender specificity because God established male and female. And I'd undermine that to the point where, like in the state of California, it is now considered discriminatory, even illegal, to refer to little boys as little boys and little girls as little girls because there's a handful of boys that think they're girls and a handful of girls that think they're boys. And on that basis, can use whichever bathroom they want to use to this day. If I were Satan, Jim Garlow said, I would do those three things. Now, what's interesting is that Joe Biden and the Obama administration, still operating, have been the greatest promoter of abortion, the redefinition of marriage, and the redefinition of gender. As Jesus said, you will know a tree by its fruit. Are you hearing what I'm saying? The NFL, the NCAA, military leaders, Christian denominations have joined Hollywood, Apple Inc., most of the mass media, the President of the United States in the commitment to destroy religious freedom and usher in a brave new world, or what the Bible describes as the end times. This is an unescapable war, but it was God's will that we would be the very people alive right now to fight this battle, to protect our nation's children from this insidious agenda of changing everything in this country, even down to their own gender. Our job is not to forfeit the legacy of our founding fathers, and above all, to defend the gospel and the church of Jesus. John Adams, first U.S. vice president and second president, signer of the Declaration of Independence, signer of the Bill of Rights, and signer of the First Amendment, said, the highest glory of the American Revolution that we talked about last week was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. Did you catch that? Listen. The highest glory of the revolution, that battle fought against the British, it was this, he said, it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. That's how they saw it in that day. Like I said, the church is what fought the revolution. He also said the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. I will avow that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God. John Witherspoon, signer of the Declaration of Independence, educator of many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, he said, "He is the best friend to American liberty who is most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down on profanity and immorality of every kind. Whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I call an enemy to this country." Now, let me modernize that to what I think the current administration would say, how they would say what John Witherspoon said. He is the best friend to American liberty who is most sincere and active in suppressing true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with the greatest firmness to promote profanity and immorality of every kind. Whoever is an avowed friend of God, I call an enemy to this country. And so the left redefined marriage by an unelected Supreme Court that ruled for all of us during the Obama administration. And now their newest campaign has been gender confusion. And the newest justice of the Supreme Court cannot give a definition of a woman when she's asked to define one, even though she is one. But her response was, "Well, I'm not a biologist." I am grateful to God for Governor Ron DeSantis and for the legislature of Florida that is standing up for parents, standing against this radical, militant, homosexual lobby and their agenda, and against Disney that is finally being seen for what it has become. And that's a bummer because, man, I love Disneyland. Walt is rolling over in his grave. Now, the politicians and spin doctors in Jesus' day, they were not reluctant to corner Jesus and his followers and try to catch him in something he said. Today's liberal government and press are out to silence his followers. So things haven't changed much, have they? Except for the fact that pastors today are holding their tongues in a way Jesus never did. The newest thing in the Biden administration is the new Ministry of Truth, who checks misinformation and disinformation. It is the disinformation czar who will come after you if you say something opposite of the administration, which actually is disinformation and misinformation. It's what they are peddling, what they are pumping out through the media, through the CDC, the EPA, all the climate change garbage and all that associated with their plan to create a new world order. The pulpit used to be the most influential voice in the country. I want to remind you, 29 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence all graduated from something that today we would call a Bible college. The pulpit was the guardian of national morality and of righteous government, which is why John Adams said that the First Amendment was initially to secure freedom of speech for the pulpit, so that the pulpit, the church, always had a voice to the government, to guide it, but never for the government to tell the pulpit what to say. However, in 1954, the Johnson Amendment was passed, and something like a dark cloud came over the pulpit. Most pastors in America chose silence and allowed liberal politicians and liberal media with an opposing worldview to become the prevailing voice of influence on national education, morals, entertainment, elections, and government, resulting in unrestrained sensuality inside and outside of marriage, 70 million abortions, a fixation with violent entertainment, the spread of humanism and hostility toward religion, in other words, a return to the Roman Empire. And the silence of the pulpit is deafening. In 1954, Johnson, a U.S. senator at the time, added a rider to a tax code that 501c3 organizations must stay out of the political arena. And he did this to silence two nonprofit groups that were critical of his re-election. The Johnson Amendment was never intended for churches. But in September of 2008, the Alliance Defense Fund, now called Alliance Defending Freedom, through an effort called the Pulpit Initiative, decided to challenge the Johnson Amendment with the help of 33 pastors who, from their pulpits, on the basis of biblical standards, endorsed and opposed presidential candidates, similar to what John the Baptist and the Lord Jesus Christ did with Herod, and then turned themselves into the IRS. I was one of those pastors. The objective Thank you. The objective was to invite the IRS to take legal action against us. We threw the first punch. And then finally, we wanted to take this to the Supreme Court and have the Johnson Amendment removed from the books. But something you need to know is that not one church or clergy member involved in the 2008 Pulpit Initiative faced prosecution. Not one church has ever had its tax-exempt status revoked since the Johnson Amendment was passed over the content of a sermon, including the churches like that of the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Reverend Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Nancy Pelosi, who seem to say anything they want. And there's no threat to them from the IRS. The Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional. It is bribery. It is government intrusion. And we proved it a paper tiger. And every year, the number of pastors who join us grow. We have thousands now that are being more bold and courageous from their pulpits. Tax exemption is a necessary precondition for the free exercise of religion. And the founding fathers made churches to be tax exempt so that the government could not tax churches out of existence, like they were doing in Britain. But the godless of our nation have called our values, like the sanctity of life, politics. And therefore we cannot preach against abortion from the pulpit or anything else that they don't want us to talk about. And there are pastors today who simply go along with this gag order, and they proudly extol that they would never say anything political from their pulpit because it would be unbiblical. And I want to ask, what Bible are they reading? Because from the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, we read about Abraham's relationship with a man named Melchizedek, which, by the way, is a title. It's not a name. It means king of righteousness. And it says he was also a high priest. A king who's also a priest. No separation of church and state there with that guy. Very next book of the Bible, Exodus, you got Moses and Pharaoh. He gets pretty politically involved there. And because he did, it leads to the release of hundreds of thousands of Jews who'd been slaves for centuries in Egypt. The Reverend Henry Beecher Ward was a contemporary of the Reverend Charles Finney. And in a sermon in March 1863, he said, "It is sometimes said that ministers must not preach politics. They would have to toe, hop, and skip and jump through 2/3 of the Bible if they did not. For there is not another book on the face of God's earth that is so full of commerce and business and government and the relations between the governing and the governed as this same Bible. How could it be otherwise when church and state were one in the whole period of the Old Testament, where the revelations were based on the coexistence of these two interests? And yet, in these later days, we have these ineffable men who would tell us we must not preach in the pulpit about public affairs, and who would scourge out of the sanctuary a full half of the Bible, infidels. Jesus solemnly warned you cannot serve both God and money. So even if the IRS could revoke a church's tax-exempt status, what would churches want more? Loss of tax deductions or continued loss of God's rule in the land, which has already resulted in the death of millions and is still leading to outright persecution of the church? In the name of being law-abiding citizens, the vast majority of churches in America have chosen to serve money over God, and in the process have become accomplices to the hijacking of what was once a nation thriving on the law of God and the teaching of Jesus Christ. I know that many of you pray for revival and awakening in our nation. But it is not going to happen until we come to the same conclusions of the Reverend Charles Finney, who led in the Second and Third Great Awakenings. He said, "The church must take right ground in regard to politics. The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this matter, but the time has come when they must act differently. God cannot sustain this free and blessed country which we love and pray for unless the church will take right ground. It seems sometimes as if the foundations of the nation are becoming rotten, and Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics. But I tell you, he does see it, and he will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics." Working and correcting politicians was part of Jesus' earthly ministry. Why? Because Jesus, according to my Bible, is God, and God is the creator of all law, natural, moral, and civil, and his laws are designed to keep us close to God and to be godly. And when the laws of the land did the opposite, that is when Jesus would say, "You have heard it said," and then he'd quote one of their laws, and then he'd say, "But I say to you," and then he'd interpret that law correctly. In fact, the most quoted sentence in the entire Bible, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, so that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life." Jesus said that. Do you know who he said it to? A politician. Did you know that? The most famous verse in the Bible, the most famous statement of Jesus, he said to a politician by the name of Nicodemus, who was a member of the Sanhedrin. And when Jesus was crucified, it was Nicodemus and another member of the Sanhedrin, whose name was Joseph of Arimathea. And they took his body off the cross, and they buried him in Joseph's tomb. A few days later, Jesus, who could have resurrected out of any tomb he wanted, resurrected out of a politician's tomb. And if the tomb of a politician can provide the environment for the resurrection of the King of Kings, there's hope for the U.S. government. Jesus' body today is the church. You put followers of Jesus in politics, you'll be putting Jesus in the government. And it won't be long until there will be a resurrection of this country to godliness in every aspect of life. Do you realize that Jesus replaced Judas with a politician? Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee. He was a member of the Sanhedrin and head of the government's lynching squad. So Christians have been in politics from the very beginning of Christianity, and I can name the first three for you: Nicodemus, Joseph, and Saul, who became Paul, the writer of 2/3 of the New Testament that we call Holy Scripture. Do you remember on the road to Damascus when Jesus met Saul and called him to follow him? He said, "Buddy, I'm going to send you to kings." And he goes to Felix and Agrippa. Saul gives his testimony. And why does Jesus do that? Why does he send Saul to kings? Because as goes the king, so goes the kingdom. And Jesus was simply doing what God has always done, and what was all throughout the record of the scriptures. He was sending his messengers to the kings of the earth, like Jonah and Nahum to Nineveh, Nehemiah to Cyrus, Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar. You just look at all the prophets In your Old Testament, they're talking to kings. And so do the Christians and the pastors that say Christians shouldn't get involved in politics. I would like to say to them, there would not be a United States if Christians did not get involved in politics. It was the prophet Isaiah who saw ahead to the day when the government would be on the shoulders of the Messiah. And in that day, Isaiah saw something completely fantastic. He saw children, not adults, children, taking predatory animals on a walk and playing hopscotch over venomous snakes. And I believe it's because when government is not on the shoulders of Jesus, it is specifically children who are not safe. When the government rested on Pharaoh's shoulders, the children were not safe. Moses had to be hid so he wasn't killed like all the other little Hebrew boys that were drowned. And when the government rested on the shoulders of numerous Old Testament kings, children were not safe, but they were offered as sacrifices to these pagan altars. When the government rested on Herod's shoulders, children were not safe. Herod represents the political attitude that viewed a child as a threat to one's freedom and security and power, as he sought to kill all the Jewish boys in a dragnet of sorts in order to find Jesus, the little boy, and kill him. And we live in a nation, in a world, that practices the execution of babies as they are a threat to the freedom and security and power of those who conceive them unintentionally. And California just passed a bill that allows a baby to be killed a month after birth, even after 9 months going full term. After a month, still don't like the baby, kill it. Calling on his peers, years ago, Charles Finney, he wrote, "Those old, stern, grand vindicators of the government of God would have thundered and lightened until they had almost demolished their pulpits if any such immoralities had shown themselves under their instructions as are common in these days. What about us? The church seems to be filled with preachers afraid to take on sin and sinful behavior. What we need today are preachers who are fearless, preachers who fear God more than man, preachers who will mount their pulpits and bring the atmosphere of heaven with them. Preachers who will speak from the borders of another world, preachers who know that no word spoken by God is without power." 19th century preacher Peter Cartwright, he understood this. And as he was preparing to deliver a sermon one Sunday, he was warned that President Andrew Jackson was in attendance. Oh, I don't like Andrew Jackson. He's the guy that put African Americans on the plantations. Democrat, by the way. So Pastor Cartwright was told, President Andrew Jackson actually is in church today. And Cartwright was asked to keep his remarks inoffensive. And during that message, he included these statements. "I have been told that Andrew Jackson is in this congregation, and I've been asked to guard my remarks. What I must say is that Andrew Jackson will go to hell if he doesn't repent of his sin." And after the sermon, Jackson strode up to Cartwright. He said, "Sir, if I had a regiment of men like you, I could whip the world."